The first time I saw my mother's name scrubbed off the church memorial plaque, I thought it was a mistake. A missing name, an administrative error. But when I saw her photographs removed from the school's wall of founders, when the local paper's anniversary article praised my father's second wife, as if she had raised me from birth, I realized this was no oversight. It was war. The town fair was always held in my mother's honor. She had organized the very first one decades ago, when the community was still learning how to come together. Yet this year, the theme had changed. Her name was not mentioned once. Instead, the spotlight fell on my stepmother, Colleen, as if she had been the pillar of our family, as if she had been the heart of the town. And there, under the banner that used to bear my mother's name, stood Colleen, smiling as if she had earned that applause. I stood frozen, the smell of caramel apples thick in the air, my hands trembling as I held the old photo album I had brought in my bag. The one Colleen had tried to throw out when she moved in. The one filled with every truth she wanted to bury. She did not know I had been preparing for this moment for months. She did not know what I was about to unveil to the entire town. My name is Evelyn Ross, and I am 38 years old. When I was a child, my mother was everything to me: graceful, kind, and quietly powerful in the way only some women are. After she died, my father remarried far too quickly, bringing Colleen into our lives like a storm wrapped in perfume. She smiled a lot in public, but behind closed doors, she treated my mother's memory like a stain to be scrubbed clean. Over the years, Colleen erased every trace of my mother she could find, from family photographs to town records. At first, I cried. Then I learned to endure. But one day, I realized I could do more than survive. I could restore my mother's legacy and expose Colleen for what she really was. This is the story of how I took back my mother's name, and how the town that once forgot her now remembers nothing else. My earliest memories are bathed in the warm glow of my mother's presence. Her name was Margaret, and to me, she was the sun. She baked bread every Sunday, her hands dusted in flour and her face lit with quiet contentment. She had a garden that spilled over with wildflowers and herbs, and her laughter, gentle, almost musical, was the sound that filled our home with peace. She was not glamorous, not loud or showy, but she had a dignity that made people soften when they spoke to her. People in town used to say she was the heart of our family, and they were right. My father, Raymond, was a practical man. He was a local contractor who valued order and efficiency. He loved my mother in his own stoic way, but I think he never quite understood how much her gentle spirit held us all together. When she passed from a sudden illness just before my 10th birthday, our home became quiet in a way that had nothing to do with sound. The world dimmed. My father grieved, at least, that is what I told myself. But within 6 months, Colleen moved into our house. Colleen was everything my mother was not. She wore high heels that clicked across our wooden floors like metronomes. She decorated the house in cold colors, white leather, sharp-edged glass, abstract art that made no sense to a child. She told me that emotions were messy and weakness was contagious. When she moved in, the first thing she did was take down the family photos that included my mother. She said it was time for a fresh chapter. At 10 years old, I did not understand how someone could erase the dead so easily. I only knew I missed the photos more than I missed the furniture. Colleen started small. First it was the photos, then the old baking tins my mother used gone. My mother's rose bushes, uprooted without explanation. She even donated my mother's old church dresses to charity and replaced them with new, bright-colored ones she claimed looked less depressing. At first, I kept quiet. I was afraid. My father called her practical and said she was helping him move on. He did not see the way she looked at me when he wasn't around. She would smile, but her eyes stayed cold. Over time, Colleen's influence grew. She joined every committee in town, church, school board, the historical society. She smiled her way into small-town power with the same glossy charm she used on my father. People liked her because she was polite, well-groomed, and knew how to say just the right thing. Meanwhile, my mother's name stopped coming up in conversations. When I brought her up in public, Colleen would quietly change the subject. "Let's not dwell on the past," she would say. Or, "She was lovely, dear, but things change." I started to feel like I was the only one who remembered Margaret Ross at all. By the time I turned 16, I had mastered the art of silence. I never cried in front of Colleen. I stopped mentioning my mother altogether. Instead, I channeled my frustration into school. I studied obsessively late into the night, flashlight under the covers, textbooks crammed with notes. I earned scholarships, worked 2 jobs, and eventually got into a solid law program. I left home at 18 and rarely came back, except on holidays when I was expected to play the role of the grateful stepdaughter. My father had grown quieter with age, and his health had started to decline. He let Colleen handle most affairs. Years passed. I became a defense attorney, slowly building a reputation for being thorough, methodical, and relentless when necessary. I never took on cases I did not believe in, but I did take on clients that no one else would touch, because I believed in fairness, even when it was unpopular. My work grounded me. It gave me control. But one thing remained out of reach: justice for my mother's memory. After my father died, I came back for the funeral. It was small, elegant, and cold, exactly like Colleen. She gave a carefully rehearsed eulogy and smiled through her own tears. At the wake, I watched her accept condolences with the grace of a politician. But what chilled me most was how my mother was never mentioned. Not once. It was as if Margaret had never existed. Colleen even introduced me to a family friend as Raymond's daughter. She was raised mostly by me. I said nothing, but I remember clutching my wine glass so tightly my knuckles went white. Later that night, I walked through the house alone. The air felt hollow. My old bedroom had been turned into a guest room. Not a single photo of my mother remained. Not even in the attic. Her letters, recipes, journals, all gone. I stood in the hallway and tried to hear her laugh again, tried to remember the way her hands smelled like rosemary and dough. But the house was silent. Sterile. Like she had been edited out of the world. That was the night I decided to stop grieving quietly. That was the night I decided to make the town remember her. And Colleen? I would make sure she watched it happen. The moment that set everything in motion came on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, 6 months after my father's funeral. I had returned to town once again, this time not for grief, but for strategy. I'd recently received an invitation to the unveiling of a new wing at the town's historical museum. Colleen was to be honored for her decades of community contribution. There it was in bold print, the Colleen Ross Cultural Wing, sponsored by the Historical Society and partially funded by my father's estate. I stared at the paper, my hands trembling. Not a word about my mother. Not even a nod to the woman who once spent hours archiving town records by hand, who taught school children the value of local history, who organized the first town charity bake sale and funded the preservation of the town's oldest church pews. Margaret Ross had been a quiet backbone of this town for years. And now, even her memory was being buried. Colleen hadn't just erased her from the house. She was wiping her from the town's memory entirely. That day, I took a walk through the cemetery. My mother's grave was small and modest, her name etched in weathered stone at the far edge of the plot, hidden behind overgrown hedges. In contrast, my father's grave, placed front and center, had been updated with a polished headstone, funded and chosen by Colleen. Margaret's grave looked forgotten, unloved. I stood there for a long time, the rain soaking through my coat, and I knew then that I couldn't stay silent any longer. I had spent years building my career, gaining influence, and learning how to uncover the truth no matter how deeply it had been buried. Colleen thought I had moved on. She had no idea I was just getting started. A few weeks later, I returned under the guise of business and began quietly reaching out to some of the older members of the community, those who still remembered Margaret Ross. I collected anecdotes, photographs, even handwritten notes she'd once sent after school events. I visited the church where she had sung in the choir and found a dusty box in the archives marked Margaret R. Inside were records of every fundraiser she had organized, every historical exhibit she helped curate, and even a faded black and white photograph of her standing in front of the old library with a ribbon-cutting pair of scissors in her hand. It was all still there, her legacy. Hidden. Forgotten. But not gone. Then I discovered something else, something that changed the game entirely. While digging through public records for an unrelated case, I stumbled across a transaction that had been filed 6 months before my father's death. It showed a transfer of funds from his personal account to a trust in Colleen's name. Not unusual on its own, until I realized the amount, over $400,000. The stated purpose? Museum development. The transfer occurred just days after he had changed his will, leaving Colleen everything and cutting me out completely. It smelled of coercion. But more than that, it reeked of a cover-up. I knew the law well enough to understand the burden of proof was high, especially in probate cases. But this wasn't just about contesting a will. This was about setting the record straight for my mother and for every quiet woman who had ever been erased by someone louder and more self-serving. I went to my office, closed the door, and pulled out a fresh legal pad. It was time to build a case, not in court, at least not yet, but in the court of public memory. The first step? Exposing who Colleen really was, not just to the museum board, but to the entire town she'd fooled. The second? Making sure Margaret Ross took her rightful place in the heart of the community again. And the third, watching Colleen's legacy crumble beneath the weight of her own lies. I had spent my entire life becoming the kind of woman who didn't flinch when wronged. Now, I would become the kind of woman who made sure justice was never forgotten. Even if that justice came decades too late. Even if it meant tearing down everything Colleen had built. Especially if it meant that. I began quietly. That's how revenge works best. No flashing lights. No confrontations. Just silent, deliberate action. I started by creating a digital archive of everything my mother had done. Each story from former students, each scanned photograph from the church, each typed letter she had once written, everything was cataloged, tagged, and dated. I created a website under the name The Real Ross Legacy and let it simmer quietly, like a whisper that grows louder with each click. Within 2 weeks, local blogs had picked it up. Then the community Facebook groups. A former librarian commented that she had always wondered why Margaret's name was left out of the museum's new wing. A retired schoolteacher posted pictures of my mother leading field trips. One of the oldest residents uploaded a scanned copy of a town newsletter from 1985 featuring my mother on the cover, planting flowers outside City Hall. The dam had cracked. The town was remembering her. Not because I told them to, but because they already did. They just needed permission. Colleen, of course, noticed. At first, she brushed it off. She made polite statements during interviews about how much she valued Margaret's contributions, while never once acknowledging how hard she had worked to erase them. But I knew better. I knew her pride was beginning to sting. The final tap in that first beat came when I organized a community walk, in her footsteps, honoring my mother's work in revitalizing the historic district. I didn't advertise it much. I just whispered about it to the right people. Over 200 residents showed up. Colleen was not one of them. But her name was on everyone's lips. And not in the way she liked. What Colleen valued above all else was image. She wore perfection like a pressed blouse. Her pearls never moved out of place. Her voice never rose above a certain octave, and her lies, well, they were always sweetly packaged as community concern. I decided to rattle that image, just a bit. I submitted a formal request to the museum board, asking why no mention of Margaret Ross had been made in the exhibit dedicated to the town's heritage. I attached documentation, photos, letters, financial statements showing her personal donations over the years. The request went public. It was the board's policy. The silence from Colleen lasted 3 days. Then she emerged with a carefully written op-ed in the local paper, praising my mother while casting herself as the humble steward who merely continued Margaret's vision. She offered to add a small plaque to one corner of the new wing. A gesture, she called it. I rejected it publicly. I wrote a response in my own name. I was no longer hiding. I detailed exactly how Margaret Ross's legacy had been whitewashed, minimized, and buried. I outlined the timeline of my father's sudden shift in estate planning. I posed polite but firm questions. How could someone so deeply devoted to community be left out of the very place she helped build? The town was already listening. Now they were leaning forward. Then came the interview. A former board member came forward anonymously to a local reporter. He claimed Colleen had lobbied hard to keep the new wing under her name alone. She said no one remembered Margaret anymore, he said. That it was her turn. Those words spread like wildfire. Suddenly, the town's sweetheart didn't seem so sweet. With pressure building, Colleen doubled down. She held a press event, standing beneath the arch of the new museum wing, with a practiced smile and well-rehearsed speech. She spoke of unity, of moving forward, of honoring the past while celebrating the future. I watched it online, from a hotel room just blocks away. And then I played my final card. Remember that mysterious trust fund I discovered? The $400,000 transferred just before my father changed his will? I traced the funds. With the help of a financial advisor friend, I found a paper trail showing the trust had paid for several upgrades at the museum, including a luxury office remodel and personal travel expenses for historical research. Not only was Colleen rewriting history, she was funding it with what should have been my inheritance. I packaged the findings neatly, sent them to the town's ethics committee, the local press, and most crucially, the museum board. And then I waited. The fallout came in waves. First, public outrage. Then a town meeting where residents demanded transparency. Finally, a full audit of museum finances was launched. Colleen was asked to step down pending review. Her perfect smile didn't make the front page that day. A blurry photo of her leaving the building, shoulders slumped, did. I had not shouted. I had not broken down her door. I had simply reminded the world who she was and who my mother had been. And I wasn't done yet. The morning of the town's annual Heritage Gala was unusually bright, as if the sky itself was determined to shine a spotlight on what was about to unfold. I arrived early, dressed in a simple black dress, nothing extravagant, but dignified. I wanted the focus to be on my mother, not me. In my hand, I held a folder. Inside it were the final pieces of what I'd been building for months. A complete dossier detailing Colleen Ross's misuse of funds, forged approval signatures, and emails that suggested she had, in fact, pressured my father into revising his will while he was medicated and weak. I had interviewed a former nurse under oath. I had collected voice memos and emails with timestamps. My legal training ensured that every piece of it was solid and verifiable. The town museum board had been reluctant to take further public action until this evening. I had arranged to present the file privately. First, to the board members and trustees in the gallery's archive room, 15 minutes before the gala began. They read through the documents, brows furrowed, lips tightening. When one board member reached the notarized statement from the nurse, she looked up at me and said, "This changes everything." I nodded. It should. That night, the gala was not what anyone expected. As the room filled with guests, some in cocktail attire, others in Sunday best, the mood was as festive as it had always been. Light jazz played in the background, wine glasses clinked, and the mayor made his usual rounds with a grin and a handshake. Then the lights dimmed for the formal presentation. A video tribute began to play on the projector screen. But it wasn't about Colleen Ross. It was about Margaret. I had submitted the new media package through anonymous sponsorship under the Ross Legacy Fund. The museum, under mounting public pressure and now legal scrutiny, had accepted the proposal without question. The video was tasteful but powerful. Footage of my mother at community events, archival photos of her working with children, organizing fundraisers, cleaning up after floods. Her voice, soft but firm, played in the background as audio clips from old interviews narrated her vision for the town's heritage. At the end of the video, her name appeared on the screen: Margaret Ross, founder of the First Heritage Trust. The heart of our history. The room erupted in applause. Across the hall, Colleen stood frozen. Her complexion drained of color. She looked as if the floor might give way beneath her. She had been expecting her own tribute. Instead, the entire town was rising to its feet for the woman she had tried to erase. Then came the final blow. The museum board chair took the microphone. Due to recent findings regarding the misappropriation of funds, she said calmly, "We are conducting an independent investigation into expenditures made during Colleen Ross's tenure as executive sponsor." Effective immediately, the cultural wing will be renamed to honor a woman whose contributions were foundational and whose memory deserves full recognition. She paused for a moment, as if to let the silence do its work. Tonight, we proudly unveil the Margaret Ross Memorial Wing. Gasps echoed through the gallery. Colleen stumbled backward into a chair. I didn't smile. I didn't clap. I just stood still, letting the moment do what it was meant to. Justice is not always loud. Sometimes, it's a quiet storm that rolls through and rearranges everything in its path. Colleen tried to speak to me on the way out. Her voice cracked, hands trembling. "Evelyn," she whispered. "Please." I didn't mean. I turned to her, not out of malice, but resolve. "I know exactly what you meant, Colleen. And now, so does everyone else." She lowered her gaze. I walked away without another word. I had brought my mother back to life, not in body, but in spirit, in story, in the legacy that could never again be erased. And I had done it on my own terms. It has been over a year since the unveiling of my mother's gallery. Sometimes, I still walk into the exhibition hall after hours, when the place is dimly lit and echoing with silence. I sit on the bench in front of her final painting, the one she never had the chance to finish, and I feel her presence. Not a ghost, not a memory, but something more living. Real. Seen. My stepmother, Cynthia, moved away shortly after the opening. Her pristine name could not bear the tarnish. She resigned from her committees, sold her house, and quietly slipped into a different life, one where her legacy was no longer sculpted by manipulation, but by shame. No one begged her to stay. Not even my father. When it came down to it, even he admitted that he had turned a blind eye too long. He has started visiting the gallery once a month, mostly alone, and I believe he's begun to understand who my mother really was. He says very little during our visits, but his silence no longer feels cruel. It feels reflective. The town changed more than I ever expected. Children learn about my mother in their art classes. Local newspapers write tributes every anniversary of her passing. Even strangers bring fresh flowers to the base of her mural on Main Street. Her name, once erased from plaques and pamphlets, is now spoken with reverence. It took time, effort, and courage, but I reclaimed her narrative. I rewrote history where it had been twisted, and I gave the truth room to breathe. As for me, I no longer carry shame for not speaking up sooner. I understand now that silence is often survival, especially in a home ruled by someone who punishes truth. But survival is not where the story ends. Legacy lives in what we fight to preserve. Sometimes people ask me why I went through all that trouble. Why I dug so deep. Why I confronted decades of lies. I tell them, because silence is a grave, and I refuse to bury the woman who gave me life. Do I regret any of it? Not for a second. My mother painted beauty into every room she entered, and I would not let the woman who envied her wipe it clean. Cynthia wanted my mother forgotten. I made sure the world would always remember her. And you? If someone tried to erase the best part of your past, would you stay quiet, or would you find your voice too?